talking about literature stuff. Oh my God. Yay. Welcome. So, I'm really glad I had all the technical difficulties at first because it left me an opportunity to say, I've only been saying I've wanted to be a professor for a little while, and I've only known good professors to have technology as a thorn in their side. I think it's a sign. But with this project, it's kind of been 2 semesters worth of work. In Dr. Ainsworth's class, I was really looking into the 21st century World War I poets. I kind of thought, I like poetry myself, so I thought it was interesting and wrote a couple papers about it. And I started noticing a trend in the literature and in the dialogue of these people and their story. So I kind of wanted to focus on that. So I'm going to start with the question of, what the heck? Because let me ask you all, how many of you have spent any time talking about or thinking of World War I poets or literary influence? Okay, teachers don't count. Teachers don't count. So that is okay. I'm not for the rest of you. But literary influence, it's a comparative literature study. It's used to focus on theme, attitude, idea, technique. So if you think of, like when we talk about Shakespeare, or any Wordsworth, or any Jane Austen, any of these really great authors and poets, they really have impacted the literature we read now, and we discussed how is it that their themes have still kind of gone throughout time, and how it influences different authors as time goes on. But Dr. Manasina made a statement in their paper, Literary Influence, a pivotal aspect in the domain of comparative literature, that it is a fruitful study as it can throw light upon a writer's individual talent, or it can unmask a plagiarist, which that's more of a concept that's been talked about in modern literature. Plagiarism was very common. It showed if you knew you knew your stuff, really, in literature. If you were able to kind of copy and remember some of the old poets, like, referencing the Odyssey or Shakespeare or anything like that. And with Sassoon and Owen, I was focusing specifically on them because they do have an interesting story. And when we're talking about narrative and talking about influence and their relationship, there's this commentary that they really kind of influence each other, but it's one-sided. Sassoon supposedly really impacted Owen's work, and he is why their poetry is the way that it is. But Wilfred Owen, he was born March 18th, 1893, died November 4th, 1918. He wrote approximately 80 poems. That number changes. A lot of it is fragments and just snippets from letters that a lot of his poems have been highly edited now, which I think adds to a layer of this discussion of how we can even determine what literary influence is with his work. It's edited together now after his death. So, and in his lifetime, only 5 were published. Most of them were in the Hydra while he was in Craiglock Park, the hospital that he was staying at. And he died at the age of 25 in action a week before the war ended. Siegfried Sassoon, he was like 6 years older than Owen, was born September 8th, 1886, and died September 1st, 1967. He wrote approximately 37 books. 28 were poetry collections, with at least 2 collections published before knowing Owen. And Owen really enjoyed his work, The Old Huntsman, and that's one of the pieces that was a trend I was seeing that people suspected Owen was influenced by. But he died of stomach cancer at the age of 81. So he got to live 60 more years than Owen did. So again, it kind of, if you keep it in your head, this kind of idea of storytelling and how we understand and define literary influence. There's all this time now in between when the poetry was written and when these people died. So it kind of, we have to fill up the spaces in between. And this, you'll appreciate this, and this is my first math bomb. Owen wrote 21 poems before meeting Sassoon, 22 after meeting Sassoon, and 3 poems were described with other influences that he actually claimed. It was either Harold Monroe, which was a Georgian poet, William Wordsworth, or Percy Shelley. Keats, I think, lives throughout his poetry. You can really see it in the style and like the floral language that he has. But 34 of these poems that a lot of people have claimed that we do have dates for don't have dates. They're either fragments or they're just dateless. We just don't know when they've been written, which I think is really interesting. Okay. And with first quotations, when I was first doing this research, I just saw, and I focus on language. So I just think it's really interesting to look at, and I know, shock and horror, Wikipedia, first one. Researchers do use Wikipedia. It's a great source for like generic information. It doesn't mean you should use it for your dissertation. But in the fourth line of Wikipedia, it states historical poetry of the horrors of trenches and gas warfare was much influenced by his mentor, Siegfried Sassoon. Wikipedia mentions Sassoon before any other influence. When you first pull up, look up Wilfred Owen, Sassoon is listed as the first one under the influence tabs, which I think is really interesting too. Because if we consider a little bit of psychology into this, the proximity principle, we're looking at how you have these themes and ideas in close proximity to each other in the literature. So you associate the idea with it, though they're closer together that way. So even if it's subconscious, it might be there. Wilfred Owen Association, I've used this site myself. It's cited in my papers, research papers from last semester. It states in the Owen the Poet section, Wilfred Owen would not have written the war poems for which he is now famous if he had not met Siegfried Sassoon in August 1917. That is the first line in that statement. And then Norton Anthology, I would hope y'all are familiar with the Norton Anthology, states that then suffering from shell shock, he was sent to the hospital near Edinburgh, where he had the good fortune to meet Siegfried Sassoon. The influence of Sassoon's satiric realism was a useful time to Owen's lush, Keatsian romanticism, which I just think is interesting. Again, in the Norton Anthology, they use Sassoon first before mentioning like Wordsworth or Shelley or any of the other potential influences in Owen's life. So just that proximity, I think, is really kind of pushing this idea that Sassoon is the reason that Owen's work was the way that it was, instead of maybe Owen already having work before that, which he did, and having kind of this interwoven idea of closely associating these topics, of trying to understand who they were and like their story at this point. But what's really interesting too is that right here, this site that I'm using, it's called Yes, very, very academic. But it's really interesting to me because there is so much cool work going on in the literary academia world with word association and kind of statistics, is looking at the amount of times words come up in a piece of literature, like word frequency. This here, what I use is I was able to plug in to different websites, and for the Wilfred Owen Association, over 1,000 people a month visit that site. So that's just an interesting idea to me, because that means anybody who's going to find this information is automatically going to get that story of Wilfred Owen wouldn't have been the poet that he was without Sassoon. That's the narrative that we're getting. So it just got me thinking that if I was going to go and look a little bit closer at the literature itself and analyzing these different articles, because focusing on the language is the most important part. These are my annotations on these. This is kind of what literary research is supposed to look like, to a certain extent. You'll see all of most of my papers are like this, of being like, who? Why? But I just started to notice a trend in all these different articles, because especially in research that we do now, I know we've all been told a lot that we should use resources from the past 20 years, try to find the most recent research, things like that, because it's new and it's innovative and we have more information, and to an extent that is really true. But when it comes to literary research, I think it's kind of more complicated than that. But if we look here, let me see. This is Hibbert. Dominic Hibbert. He is now one of the most well-known organizers of Owen's work. He was the fourth person to collect his poetry together. He's written a lot of papers about him. This paper is called Wilfred Owen with the Georgians, which Georgian poetry is actually really interesting. Somebody should do a capstone on that, I just started to see a contradiction. Because up here, he's talking about how Owen's poetry, Dulce et Decorum Est, is often cited by students as Owen's most representative work, but it needs to be seen as one of his earlier war poems written in October 19th under Sassoon's immediate influence. But then, right down there in the footnote, right down here, I know it's tiny, I'll read it. At one time, I thought that some of Owen's poems in Sassoon's style were written in 1918, but fresh evidence has accumulated that I'm now persuaded that almost all of them, in their first drafts at least, belong in the autumn of 1917. So, potentially before they had much of a relationship. The Century, for example, was finished late in 1918, but the first draft, recently on display in Weatherford, is on a paper otherwise used only at catalog art, and its draft ending is much more Sassoonish than that of the final version. What's interesting too is he mentions that these papers, there's a stack of them, and there's multiple different dates all over them, and a lot of them are not dated. So for all we know, Owen could have just held on to these papers and have poems written from years before, and dated a few of them later, and now we're just associating all of them with 1918 or 1917, which I kind of think is interesting when we're trying to understand how we're defining the literary influence with these people, and then kind of getting it mingled with really narrative at a certain point. Let me go back, because this article was really interesting to me as well, because this is from David Hipp. I just started noticing with all these different people, y'all don't need to know who these are, that's okay, but author Lane, there's a lot of different people who have collected these works together, and it was just showing that there is kind of contradiction in these critiques themselves, because we're claiming here that Lane organized these poems together, but then in actuality his dates were wrong. So we've just built a story instead of actually having factual evidence of who these people are, these poems. And then part of the front is you have to get back to the literature. So these two poems, why I'm comparing these is because with the rear guard, that is Sassoon, that's from the Old Huntsman. Owen did really enjoy his work when he had met Sassoon. He was nervous to meet him. He hadn't gotten to interact with another poet like this before, and appreciated Sassoon's work in the Old Huntsman. So I wanted to use the rear guard to kind of showcase, compared to a similar length poem of Owen's that's in our Norton anthologies. Both of these are in our anthologies, actually, and how they're different and maybe where they are the same. But with Owen's poem, Dulce et Decorum Est, it's 28 lines. The rear guard is only 25 lines. Owen, if you can tell, both have a lot of notes, but Owen uses a lot of literary techniques. He uses repetition. He uses a lot of consonants and just these different patterns. And I also noticed that there was kind of this break in theme. He starts out the poem with the kind of telling the story of remembering being in action. We're giving a very clear description of these soldiers kind of fumbling and being bombed by this gas, and then it breaks into his message that he's trying to portray of being like, this is the lie of the war, that you wouldn't sit here and argue for us to join if you understood the pain that we were going through. Well, Sassoon's theme maintains a very angry tone throughout it. If anything, I saw some similarity in theme, which makes sense. They fought in a war together, so I would understand why that would be the same. So with that, I went on a field trip. Because I was seeing all these contradictions, and our library is great, but I couldn't find all the information I wanted with the literature that I did have. So Dr. Smith suggested that I get a texture card. And let me tell you, this is my soapbox for the texture card. You want to feel like a nerd. Because you get to go into any college library, and they'll be like, who are you? What are you here for? And I'm like, there's my card, and they kick it to whatever you want. It's awesome. And this was one piece that I found while there. This is another article by Hibbard. It's just Wilford Owen, War Poems and Others. He published it in 1973. It was one of his, or 1975. This is one of his second collections discussing Owen's work. And I just thought it was really interesting because if we look up here, he makes a claim that it is not surprising that even in later drafts of The Deadbeat, which Owen did claim that he was trying to write in Sassoon's style with that poem, he moved away from Sassoon's style. His mind was, in any case, more eccentric and original than his heroes. But then later, down here, he makes a claim that it was meeting Sassoon, not seeing war at first hand, that finally set his talent free. Which I think is interesting, because why? For somebody, he wrote this nearly 50 years after Owen has died, and Sassoon has been dead for at least 10 years at this point. So to claim that their interaction was more influential than them being in trench warfare kind of seems a little harsh to me. And when they met at that time, Sassoon was in the war because, and in that hospital, because he had kind of been writing a lot of articles and poems against the war effort, so they sent him there to kind of silence him, saying that he was experiencing shell shock. While Owen was there because he was blown into the air by a shell and had to stay in a trench with his dead comrades for several days before anybody found him. So when you know the context of their story like that, it's kind of interesting to talk about literary narrative and literary influence and how that kind of shifts over time, because we're just filling in the spaces. And none of this work is really to discredit Hibbard. It's just to kind of show how even in our own critiques and our own analysis that we're making of these pieces, there is contradiction and what that might mean and imply to work moving forward. And so we were able to find this kind of clip from a collection in 1973 from Dominic Hibbard, where he talks about exposure and the timeline. And I thought this was kind of interesting because he states the final MS is written on the same paper as a Meyer poem, almost certainly dated from September 1918. And it seems unlikely that the finished poem would even date from so early in 1917, though S.S. Sassoon is written, Sassoon and a letters footnote have suggested that it does. Sassoon himself made a claim that the manuscript of one of his most dynamically descriptive war poems, Exposure, is dated February 1917 and proves that he had already found authentic utterance of his own. And then I found another contradiction and A Blessing of a Book by Gertrude White, who her citations, bless her, it was so clear and organized, because then I actually found Siegfried's Journey, which is the book he wrote and kind of talked about Owen, a very short excerpt and their relationship. And this was just to kind of show and go back and look a little bit closer at the opinions of the poets that did know Owen. A lot of those letters and interviews are lost to time now. They've either been sealed for privacy or they're just lost. Owen's mother had a lot of his letters and poems burned. Sassoon also had a large collection of his letters between him and Owen burned. So there's so much of the story and of their poetry that we don't know. And Robert Graves, who met Owen at Craiglock Park because of Sassoon, that's where I would give Sassoon some credit to this. If he did kind of open up Owen's kind of lens to the relationships he could have with other poets around him. And he wrote in a letter to Edward Marsh, I have a new poet for you, just discovered one Wilfred Owen, the real thing. And this letter is just, I couldn't find the sealed letter from that quotation, but this is a letter from Graves to Owen, encouraging him to write more poetry. And the earliest references that I have in articles from this time is from 1950 or so, because we can't get a hold of those other archived articles. And then this led me back to with White and her suggestion with Siegfried's Journey. And I found it really interesting because it just showed kind of this theme over time, how instead of going back to the literature, we kind of filled it in with story and made these claims with the research that we have about these people and their work, and then kind of subconsciously developed, oh, well, this is why this poem wrote the way they did. But Siegfried was very clear in talking about like his masterpiece, The Strange Meeting, and it being a conclusive testimony of his power and originality. And he did claim, it has been loosely assumed and stated that Wilfred modeled his war poetry on mine. My only claimable influence was that I stimulated him towards writing with compassionate and challenging realism, which I don't think Owen lacked that. There was something about his Kentish style that is really nice and soft compared to what they had to experience. And then his printed letters are evidence that the impulse was already strong in him before he had met me. The clue to his poetic genius was sympathy, not only in his detached outlook on humanity, but in all his actions and responses towards individuals. And to go back to the poetry, because I think that's where you're supposed to go when you're actually looking at literary influence and trying to decide what is more significant. We have to look at the poetry itself. So these two poems, The Dugout, Siegfried claimed unconsciously I was getting near to Wilfred Owen's method of approach when he wrote this poem, compared to Anthem for Doomed Youth, which is one of Wilfred Owen's most well-known poems. It's the first one that's listed in our anthology. And also why this is so important to talk about with World War I poets or war poetry or war literature in general is these are some of the first instances that we see that the soldier is able to depict what they were witnessing. It wasn't a general who was educated. It wasn't some pope or some preacher talking about the soldier. It was the soldier, now literate, able to share this artwork. But we see a lot of Keats' style and Anthem for Doomed Youth. It's very lush and languid, glimmers of goodbyes, and kind of this personification and the repetition of it, and allusions to the church. There's a lot of literary technique in that poem compared to The Dugout, which was written in 1918, late 1918. He does uses consonants like Owen does in a lot of his poems. He uses one detail that was a darling I had to kill, and now I brought it back, is this pattern that I saw with the word choice used. A lot of Owen's poetry, and I couldn't count them all, didn't have the time. A lot of Owen's poetry uses first person or second person to describe the experiences of the war, while Sassoon uses a narrative. He uses kind of this third person dialogue, which I think if you consider when you're reading literature that uses the I, it allows you to be the I in that narrative, which I think changes the impact and kind of the tone of the literature. But in The Dugout, Sassoon starts to really use that kind of tone in the first and second person. And there was some corrections done for Anthem for Doomed Youth. Sassoon suggested that Owen changed his title. He had Anthem for Dead Youth. He changed it to Doom. But to claim that this is a drastic example of literary influence, I think is a really big claim, because it just seems like they worked on poetry together. And I think that's kind of where it gets muddled a little bit with literary influence and kind of evaluating this literature, is that we do have to go back to the literature, and it makes you wonder, kind of after a certain point, where these people's work, because it's been over 100 years since they wrote these poems, where the work kind of develops this personhood, and kind of becomes separate from the artist who created it, and lives its own kind of life beyond that, and kind of what that means for the work that we analyze. And these are all my citations. There's a lot more. These are for the pictures and everything that I use in my presentation, but thank y'all so much.
I have a question.
Yes.
So, as someone who is not familiar with anthologies, a little offense to that, like, how did you get started on this, like, topic? Like, was it something that was assigned to you in class? Did you get to choose it? Like, where did this all begin?
The assignment was with Dr. Ainsworth. We were writing papers and needing to make our multimodal for the 21st century authors, and nobody was focusing, well, most people were focusing on authors that we had looked at previously, because we had a short amount of time for the 20th century. And she kind of gave us a challenge, like, if anybody wants to do it in the course, I was like, sure, yes, I will. So I picked them out because I like poetry, and I really enjoyed reading their work. So it just became this comparative project where I was looking at their work and their story, and I thought it was really interesting. And then it developed over time where I started noticing this kind of theme and trend with the word choice in the literature, because that's a lot of what I focus on is the language itself, and being like, why is it that you're making this claim, but then you contradict yourself right here in this claim? What does that mean? Why? And I just went to our library, and Jared saw me, Claire saw me, and I pulled out every anthology that I could find, and physically was going through and looking to see who was in the anthology and who wasn't, what did they say about the anthologies, and I kept getting really strange, contradicting claims, and they only went back to the earliest 1930s, and I was like, Owen's been dead for 20 years, so what did he say? And we don't know. So, and that I think is fun with the research. It just allows more questions after a certain point. Yes.
So can you give, I guess, was there like a conclusion or a result, or did you decide there was a literary interest, like to be determined, stay tuned, or?
I think what I would claim, in my humble opinion, is that Owen already had poetic genius before he met Sassoon, but both of their work is influential for what they needed to do and the message that they were trying to portray. I think it's more of a claim that it's complicated, and that trying to pick a cut and dry answer to who influences who makes up our work besides ourselves becomes really gray, when I think they probably just influenced each other and wrote about the same theme and kind of like shared work with each other and try to grow from there. And then we have all this time, like Owen died at 25, like Keats did. There's all these romantic elements to their story, and what we know about them.
Would you, like, if you, like, say next semester you had all the time and money in the world, would you investigate this further, like, or what would you do to investigate this further?
I would investigate it further. I think I will to a certain extent. I will admit I want to give like a day of myself to be like, okay, I can't look at you anymore. Because I have looked at so many articles and so many anthologies, And I would. It is really interesting in general, this kind of concept of like the contradiction and hypocrisy we have in the literature that we write, and then why that even matters. What does it matter to our work that we create? That's why humanities is so interesting. It is storytelling. We're just looking at these people and being like, I see myself there. How can I take that and make something? And and what will it mean once I'm gone? How much of my work is going to live past me? So, yeah, I think it was really fun. I really enjoyed the project. There's so many things that I wanted to talk about. So many things. So I was going to make a whole list and be like, please, y'all need to take these and make something out of it. Yes.
Claire, yes, did you go into this with a favorite of these two poets, and did that bias affect any of your controversial?
Well, just like what was talked about in the presentation yesterday, there is humanism. So yeah, I think there was a bias. I enjoyed Owen's poetry more, just reading it, but I also really appreciated what Sassoon was trying to do. I guess if there is a little bias in the sense that I kind of think it's interesting to make these really big claims and be like, so-and-so is a better poet, they made this poet the way they are. And I'm like, yeah, but his work sounds better. So yeah, a little bit.
Who really won?
Yeah. But I wouldn't say, I think I've grown a great appreciation for both of them. Sassoon did do a lot of work to collect all his poems together and kind of keep his memory alive and things like that. He tried to do that for a lot of his comrades, but I still really like reading Owen's work more. Yes.
I said, what factors made you want to look more into this? Like, what kind of caught your attention?
Just the contradiction in the language of looking at just those two articles, for example, at the beginning of being like, y'all are saying two different things. It's like the same kind of theme about these people, but it's still really strange when I've seen other claims that describe Owen as like a myth maker and all this kind of stuff. So then it's like, well, how is it that we can put so much weight in these statements instead of actually analyzing the literature itself?
Do you think so that narrative is really based on how early Owen died, and if maybe he had had the chance to have lived longer and written more, that narrative might be different?
Oh, I'm sure it would have. Yeah, I'm sure it would have. I do wonder a little bit if his writing would have stopped after the war had ended, because I do think the war, if anything, kind of opened him up to a bigger theme. It gave him something to talk about.
Yeah.
Me and Dr. Smith talk about it a lot with like the Georgian poets. That's an interesting concept in Chile. Is these anthologies that existed and then they kind of like fizzled out, died. We don't know anything about them. And a lot of the poets who wrote in those are war poets now. So it seems like it gave them the same theme. Is that it? Yes.
What is an anthology? I haven't Googled it yet, but I'm pretty close.
Particular capstone by itself. How we determine what pieces are worth collecting together is strange to me.
And frustrating sometimes.
It is. But yeah, it's just a collection of works that have over time be worth studying. So it's just, I think it's more a matter of opinion. Whoever yeah.
The editor heavily shapes what goes in, and then by the entries where they preface what you're about to read, they can shape a reader's understanding of what.
Oh, so there's like some like text before the genuine thing. Okay,
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
And then even in the works that they choose to include by that author versus a different one, and the placement of the works versus, in one text versus another can influence people. That's why a lot of us were really upset when Norton got rid of Mya McKinney, for instance. But that's a whole other.
Sounds terrible, yeah.
All your day.
Bring up a placard.
Bias!
Owen had written
Like 21 poems before being Sassoon, like 22.
I counted all those.
Yeah, no. So like 22 after?
Uh-huh.
Do we know how many Sacred Sassoon wrote in the years after he met Owen until he died?
Hundreds. He started, after the war ended, he didn't write as much poetry anymore. He wrote more books. But we see that a lot, actually, in these World War I poets. Like Robert Graves, he was known for his poetry, and then he just wrote books. So that's what makes me wonder whether or not Owen would have continued to write poetry, or it would have changed to something else, because I would imagine, like, the trauma that it was, that kind of tried to like, push it away to a certain extent. Yeah. You rose your hand?
Well, I was just wondering, kind of, if your point here is that maybe there's too much attention paid to the influence of Sassoon on Owen, are there other influences that you think we should pay more attention to?
Probably Keats or the Romantics. He talked about the Romantics a lot. He loved Percy Shelley. His language is very Keatsish. It's very floral and soft compared to what he was talking about. And talking about, like, he was influenced by the other Georgian poets that were around him, and the other war poets as well. Harold Monroe was one. He was in the Georgian anthologies. He enjoyed Robert Graves. I think to claim that it's just like this one thing is the reason why we make the work that we do is very shallow. I would imagine that it's a lot more complex than that.